Hello, students. I am your teacher or guide or someone who actually is ready to let you know what you need to know in English literature. So, today, what we are going to learn is very important from English literature perspective. All of us know that Harold Bloom is a very, very important character or a very, very important critic whom you must study, must know if you really want to understand the arena of English literature. Harold Bloom has written a book named The Anxiety of Influence, a Theory of Poetry. The title itself says a lot, but many of us feel it difficult to understand what is actually meant by it. What is the anxiety of influence? What does it mean? So today we are going to understand what anxiety of influence is. It was the first in a series of books that advanced a new visionary or antithetical. So this word, antithetical, many of you might not know. It means that opposed to. Antithetical means opposed to. Antithetical approach to literary criticism. So, what is the line? I'm reading out again. It was the first in a series of books that advanced a new revisionary or antithetical approach, means opposed approach to literary criticism. So, what is literary criticism? You will be saying that it is like critics who give their different views on literature or something. But do you actually know what is literary criticism is? If not, then know it now. So it means that you give the reader a sense of the writer's overall purpose and intent. Then you analyze, means you examine how the structure and language of the text convey its meaning. Then you interpret. Interpret means state the significance or importance of each art of the text. Assess means make judgment of the work's worth or value. So what is literary criticism? What does it do? First of all, it gives the reader a sense of the writer's overall purpose and intent. A literary critic does that. Then he or she, or maybe it's like you, if you are a literary critic, you analyze means you examine how the structure and the language of the text convey its meaning. Then you interpret means state the significance or importance of each art of the text. Then assess. Assess means make a judgment of the work's worth or value. So that is literary criticism. But what we are understanding from this line is that it was the first in a series of books that advanced a new revisionary or antithetical, means opposed approach to literary criticism. So whatever that is written out here in the anxiety of influence, it is antithetical or opposed to literary criticism. So basically, it means that Bloom didn't actually criticize the poets, but what he actually did was to appreciate and understand the process, how the small minority of strong poets managed to create original work in spite of the pressure of the influence. So now you know what is in anxiety of influence is all about. But still, there are many more things to understand because it is a very critical thing. Many of us misunderstand it, and then in the exam they make mistake, write the answers wrong. So you must have a clear perspective, clear idea of what you are studying. So keep on listening, and if you are liking it, obviously press the like button out there. And if you want to say something, because your comments are very, very important for me to understand if I'm doing it right or wrong, so you can comment down below. And also you can share it with your friends. And then if you are really liking whatever I'm saying, you can subscribe to this channel. Whatever, let it be, and we just continue with our anxiety of influence. Okay. Bloom's central thesis is that poets are hindered in their creative process by the ambiguous. We all know what ambiguous means, but those who don't know, it is meaning like being unclear, okay? Not clear or decided, it's unclear. So Bloom's central thesis is that poets are hindered in their creative process by the ambiguous relationship they necessarily maintain with the precursor poets. How Bloom explains the meaning of weak poets. So you know that in Anxiety of Influence he has told about strong poets and weak poets. So how Bloom explains the meaning of weak poets. What he says is that every poet has an extra literary influence on him. What is extra literary? Outside or the boundary of literature. So every poet has an extra literary influence on him, and Bloom argues that therefore the poet in a poet is inspired to write by reading another poet's poetry and will tend to produce work that is in danger of being derivative, means imitative of existing poetry. So it results in a weak poem. It happens because the earlier poet makes it clear through their work that they must survive in the future generations. Therefore, they leave no stone unturned in their writings. So, when the later poets get inspired by their work and start to write, they generally tend to imitate them. So, what did we understand? The thing is, when our earlier poets have written something, they always tried to make it in such a manner so that they don't keep any stone unturned. There's left nothing to the future poets to give or develop into it. Here, the weak poets get influenced by those earlier poets and merely imitate them, and that doesn't result in a good poetry or anything new or anything in the field to understand or give into the form of literature. So what did Harold Bloom say? That every poet has an extra literary influence on him, and Bloom argues that therefore the poet in a poet is inspired to write by reading another poet's poetry, means the earlier poet's poetry, and will tend to produce work that is in danger of being imitative or derivative of the existing poetry. They will imitate the existing poetry. So it results in a weak poem. So that results in a weak poem. It happens because the earlier poet, why is this thing happening? This phenomena, the situation, why is it prevailing? It happens because the earlier poet makes it clear through their work that they must survive in the future generation, that their work must survive in the future generation. Therefore, they leave no stone unturned in their writings. So when the later poets gets inspired by their work and start to write, they generally tend to imitate them. It is very difficult to create something new in these closed chambers of inspiration and creation. So you understand how the chambers are closed, how the earlier poet is influential to the later poet, so they can't create something new. Okay, because poets historically emphasize an original poetic vision in order to guarantee their survival into posterity. Posterity means future generation. So the earlier poets guarantee or make it very clear that they survive in their posterity or future generation through their work. So the influence of the precursor poets inspires a sense of anxiety in the living poet or the present poet. So this influence that the present poet is feeling, it creates anxiety within the poet that how am I going to innovate something out here? It's so close, it's so obvious that there's nothing wrong. So the influence of the precursor poet inspires a sense of anxiety in the living poets. Now you're kind of understanding what this anxiety of influence means. Anxiety of influence is the problem that the present poet or the living poet face from the previous poet, that there is nothing left to be done in the area of the poetry that is already been worked on by the precursor or the earlier poet. That is the problem they are facing. So the influence of the precursor poet inspires a sense of anxiety in the living poets. Such an agon means it is an ancient Greek term for a conflict, struggle, or contest. Okay. Such an agon, Bloom argues, depends on six revisionary ratios. So Bloom says that this kind of problem depends upon six revisionary ratios which reflect Freudian and quasi-Freudian defense mechanism. So defense mechanism is very clear to us. You all have that defense mechanism, okay? So whenever we face a problem or a situation, we get defensive. Our defense mechanism works, okay? So that is defense mechanism. So Bloom argues depends on six revisionary ratios which reflects Freudian and quasi-Freudian defense mechanism. Here the problem is the present poet is facing influential stress, and that is his problem, and so he is creating a defense mechanism, and that has been explained in the anxiety of influence by Bloom through six revisionary ratios. So what are those six revisionary ratios? Okay. So what Bloom studied was a defense mechanism that the strong poets studied was a defense mechanism that the strong poets produced while they faced this conflicting situation with their precursors. So weak poets failed, they imitated, okay, but the strong poets, those who faced the situation and applied their defense mechanism and came out. So Bloom studied what the defense mechanism that the strong poets produced. So what was the defense mechanism that the strong poet produced, and they came out of this conflict and made something new. So he studied that. Those are the six ratios we will be talking about. They tried and did cut through the fine line of creative power and created something new. Who created? The strong poets, okay? Without being derivative, means imitative of their precursor poets. So they faced the situation. They were about to fall in the prey of imitativeness, but they didn't. The strong poets didn't. And they cut through the situation through some formula or some ratios or something. Those are the six ratios that we'll be talking about. So they stood out and were able to make a place in their posterity. So those strong poets were able to come out with flying colors from all the influential barriers they faced. So they were the winners. So Bloom had spent a decade studying the romantic poets of the early 19th century before writing the book Anxiety of Influence. So what did Bloom do? Bloom had spent a decade studying the romantic poets of the early 19th century before writing the book Anxiety of Influence. This is reflected in the emphasis given to those poets and their struggle with the influence of John Milton, Robert Browning, and Edmund Spenser. So what did it reflect? So he studied the romantic poets, and whom the romantic poets were influenced by. This is reflected in the emphasis given to those poets and their struggle with the influence of whom? John Milton, Robert Browning, and Edmund Spenser. Other poets analyzed range from Lucretius, he is a Roman poet, and Dante, Walt Whitman, Wallace Stevens, and John Ashbery. In Anxiety of Influence and other early works, Bloom claimed that influence was particularly important for post-Enlightenment poets. So who were the Enlightenment poets? The 17th and the 18th century poets. Okay, the post-Enlightenment poets, for them, this influence factor was very, very difficult, very, very problematic. Okay. Conversely, he suggested that influence might have been less of a problem for such poets as Shakespeare and Ben Jonson, because we all know that before Shakespeare and Ben Jonson, there were no such great poets other than Chaucer. Okay, so influence was not a very big deal for Shakespeare and Jonson, but later on, after Bloom changed his mind, and the most recent edition of the Anxiety of Influence included a preface claiming Shakespeare was troubled early in his career by the influence of Christopher Marlowe. So he said that Shakespeare and Ben Jonson were not that much influenced by the earlier, because they didn't have those great early poets or something. But later on he changed his mind and said that no, Shakespeare was influenced by Christopher Marlowe, because Christopher Marlowe was one of the greatest. Okay, if he wouldn't have died so early, maybe he would have been greater than Shakespeare. But Shakespeare was lucky enough that Christopher Marlowe died, and then Shakespeare was there, his path was clear, and he flourished. Okay, whatever. So now we were in our conversation of anxiety of influence. So what happened? The book itself, the anxiety of influence, the book itself is divided into six major categories called six revisionary ratios. So you must remember that the anxiety of influence has those six revisionary ratios, six major categories or six revisionary ratios that was analyzed by Bloom. What makes a strong poet, and what makes a weak poet a weak poet. Okay, so what are those six revisionary ratios? Let's know. You can make a note of it. You must write it down. You must remember them, because questions from them are always coming in your UGC net. So never forget. I will read out the names and then I'll explain it to you. Okay, so make a note. First one is Klinamen, Clinamen. Second one is Tessera, Tessera. Third is kenosis, Kenosis. Fourth one is demonization, Daemonization. Fifth one is ascesis, Askesis. And the last but not the least, the sixth one is apophthegms, Apophthegms, apophthegms. So, six revolutionary ratios. Bloom introduces six revolutionary ratios in the following manner. He has also said about them in his map of misreading also. Okay. So the first one, Klinamen. Bloom defines this as poetic misreading or misprison. So what is Klinamen? Bloom has defined it as poetic misreading or misprison. Misprison means, what is misprison? Now you'll be asking. Okay, so misprison is a term of English law used to describe certain kinds of offense. Writers on criminal law usually devise misprison into two kinds, negative and positive. Okay, so that is misprison. So what did Bloom say? Write it down. Klinamen, about Klinamen. It's a poetic misreading or misprison. Very good. The poet makes a swerve. SWERV. Swerve. Swerve means change or cause to change direction abruptly. मैंने फटाक से मोड़ लिया गाड़ी, ऐसा चल रहा है गाड़ी, फटाक से मोड़ लिया. The poet makes a swerve, like फट से टर्न मार लिया. The poet makes a swerve away from the precursor in the form of a corrective movement. So the poet has moved his direction, has changed his direction suddenly from the precursor poet, as if, like to say, as a corrective movement, like correcting him. Okay. The swerve suggests that the precursor went accurately up to a certain point. Like the precursor बहुत अच्छा भला जा रहा था, एकदम ठीक से जा रहा था, but to a certain point, but should have swerved in the direction that the new poem moves. But उसने क्या किया, गलती कर दी, उसने टर्न नहीं मारा जब उसको टर्न मारना चाहिए था. वो चलता गया, इसलिए वो गलत हो गया, प्रिकर्सर पोएट गलत हो गया. लेकिन जिसने टर्न मारा, अभी जो लिविंग पोएट है वो टर्न मारा, जो स्ट्रॉन्ग पोएट है उसने टर्न मारा, सो वो गलती को सुधार रहा है. सो व्हाट इज ट्राइंग टू से इज that the precursor poet was going right on his way of explaining the poet or doing it right. Everything is very good. Then suddenly what happened? He didn't take a U-turn. He should have taken a U-turn in his thought process at a certain point. Only then he could have been perfectly alright. But he didn't do that. He just went on, and that's why he failed. But now the living poet is saying that ठीक है, you were explaining the poem in the right way, everything was going good, fine, but you didn't take the U-turn at the right moment. So I'm doing it for you and I'm explaining it in the right way. So it's a corrective movement. So you must appreciate it, and they are not imitating him, and they're changing, and that is a good thing. So this verb suggests that the precursor went correctly, accurately up to a certain point, but should have swerved in the direction that the new poem moves. Bloom took the word clinamen from Lucretius. I told you he was a classical poet, Lucretius. He took the clinamen word Bloom has taken from Lucretius, who refers to swarms of atoms that make changes possible. So, very good. Tessera. Tessera, Bloom defines this as completion and antithesis. A person or thing that is the direct opposite of someone or something else. You understood? Tessera, Bloom defines this as a completion and antithesis. Antithesis means a person or thing that is the direct opposite of someone or something. Right. The author completes his precursor's work retaining its terms but meaning them in a new sense. So the author, the living poet, completes his precursor work retaining its terms but meaning them in a new sense. As though the precursor had failed to go far enough, the word tesra refers to a fragment that together with other fragments reconstitute the whole. ऐसा बोल रहे हैं कि like कुछ तो जोड़ा उसने जो कि कुछ बनाया द प्रिकर्सर पोएट, बट ही मिस्ड आउट समथिंग, सो कंप्लीट नहीं हुआ, जस्ट ठीक से नहीं हुआ, तो वो फ्रैगमेंट जो इनकम्प्लीट था उसको जोड़ रहा है द स्ट्रॉन्ग पोएट. दैट्स व्हाट ब्लूम इज सेइंग. that is tesra. The word tesra refers to a fragment that together with other fragments reconstitutes the whole. Bloom is referring to ancient mystery cults who would use tesra as tokens of recognition. Gnosis, K-E-N-O-S-I-S. Bloom defines this as a breaking device similar to the defense mechanism our psyche employs against. So, the defense mechanism, again, here comes. Bloom defines this as a breaking device similar to the defense mechanism our psyche employ against रिपीटेशन कंपल्शन. लाइक जो भी रिपीट होता है उसके अगेंस्ट जो डिफेंस मैकेनिज्म काम करता है उसको क्नियोसिस बोल रहे हैं. Bloom defines this as a breaking device similar to the defense mechanism our psyche employs against repetition compulsion. In other words, a movement towards discontinuity with the precursor. So, kniosis means the discontinuity. The discontinuity को mean कर रहा है kniosis. The poet humbles himself as though he were ceasing to be a poet, but does so in such a way as to empty out the precursor poem too, so that the latter poet is not deflated as much as may seem. Bloom took the word gnosis from St. Paul, who uses it to refer to Jesus accepting his own reduction from divine to human status. Demonization, Bloom defines this as a movement towards a personalized counter sublime in reaction to the precursor's sublime. The author suggests that the powers in the precursor poem actually derive from something beyond it. The poet does so to generalize away the uniqueness of the early work. Bloom took the term demonization from Neoplatonism, where it refers to an adept being aided by an intermediary who is neither divine nor human. So ऐसे बोला जा रहा है कि like कोई डेमन आके वो कर रहा है, उसको रिएक्शन दे रहा है कि like करो ऐसा कुछ. Like movement towards a personalized counter sublime in reaction to the precursor sublime. मतलब वो जो काउंटर कर रहा है ना वो डेमन कर रहा है, ठीक है, डेमनाइजेशन ऐसा करके. Ascesis is like Bloom defines this as a movement of self-purgation which intends the attainment of a state of solitude. ठीक है, ascesis मतलब movement of a self-purgation मतलब purifying with intent that attain of a state of solitude. मतलब तुम अकेले ही कर सकते हो solitude. ओके, वो जो मतलब प्योरिटी अटेंड करना, पुरगेशन, प्यूरिफाई हो जाना. The author curtails the impression of his or her own human and imaginative endowment in order to separate themselves from others and stress his or her own individuality. The poet does this in such a way as to do the same to the precursor, whose limitation and individuality are also emphasized, separating him or her from the later poet. Bloom took the word ascesis or asceticism from sensual pleasures, from the pre-Socratic philosophers. Okay, now the last one, apophthegms. Bloom defines this as a return of the dead. मतलब वो जो precursor है उसका return होना. The poet towards the end of his or her life opens up his poem, this time deliberately rather than naturally, to the precursor's influence. But this deliberateness creates the uncanny effect that the precursor's work seems to be derivative of the latter, means imitative of the latter. मतलब उसको ऐसा लगता है कि मैंने उसी को imitate किया है, the precursor को imitate किया है. Bloom took the word apophthegms from the Athenian concept of the days on which the dead returns to re-inhabit the house in which they once lived. Okay, इसका मतलब ऐसा है कि उसको ऐसा लगता है कि मैंने उसी को कर तो नहीं दिया ऐसे ही. ठीक है. So that's all for today. I hope you liked it. I hope I explained it to you nicely and you understood everything. If you did, then do hit the like button, comment down below, write whatever you want to tell me, and if you really like it, please subscribe my channel. For now, bye.